Thank you very much, Sione, and glad to be here. Given time constraints, I can only very briefly identify the focal concerns of my piece here, and then barely hint at the substance of the writing, which is tracing a genealogy of watching across our history. I speak as a white male whose deepest education and formation has come at the hands of inner city, East Side Detroit, low-income Black folks who for more than 35 years have wrestled me into slowly becoming more human. Black anger and Black humor have been my deepest teachers, such that now my primary accountability is not the inner city seminary, ecumenical theological seminary, where I teach most of the time, but the activist and arts communities in Detroit over the last 8 years in particular, translating into ongoing struggle over water shutoffs, including nonviolent civil disobedience and arrest. Then over the last 20 years, more deep schooling from my Filipino wife about US colonial relations with her homeland, and then with her, a concerted turn to indigenous communities here in the US and back in the Philippines to learn a very different orientation to life and the more than human world than anything we are doing in our civilized modern Western existence that is destroying the planet. How think liberation today at the end of the modern world as we know it? Among other conceits, the Euro-colonial modernity that has stretched itself across much of the planet today has prided itself on championing a progressivist vision of freedom, galvanized perhaps most forcefully in the early French Revolution, but certainly taken up with heaviest international weight in the so-called American experiment, issuing in almost unassailable self-attributions on the part of US denizens of American exceptionalism. Yet by accounts critical and eschewing mere cliches, the resulting freedom, so-called, reveals itself as actually a profound reduction of human skill and adaptability, and a profound bondage to the entire techno-corporate prosthesis of petrostate industry and extractive energy, now gone global and all-consuming in neoliberal rampages around the world. Indeed, the word itself, in Germanic root, a riff on freethum, actually references the liberty/dominion characteristic of a baron, which is to say it builds on the idea of a freedom from restraint, which is elite and predicated in part on the bondage of others. Yet another part of its etymology, however, references the conditions of animals unconstrained by human domestication and thus wild. And it's this latter implication which will exercise my concern here, and implied in that very notion of wildness, colonial though the term may be, a profound evolutionary embeddedness in vastly complex and intricate webs of shared interdependence and mutualism. And here's the throwdown focus of this writing. I would insist it's not enough today merely to focus on freedom from oppressive and exploitive restraint, as if the epitome of human being is the ceaselessly promulgated corporate delirium of being able to walk into a store, physically or digitally, with a fat wallet, confronted with an almost endless array of choices to purchase life, enslaved and packaged in commodity form without thought or concern for where the material comes from and whose labor secured such, or where it goes after consumptive use, abuse, and discard. Certainly, liberation from needs constant attention and organizing and activism and policy vigilance, and my life has been about that. But today, even more urgent must be the question of the kind of reality into which that liberation lands the one so freed. Into what shall we imagine we're being liberated? Infinite and unconstrained choice at every level of existence, or a reciprocal demand of mutual flourishing for a season, issuing in the necessity to then wither and decay? Yes, with style and beauty all along the way, like the season of autumn itself across many ecozones, giving place to other creatures and beings whose own flourishing requires our own limitation and demise. Each of these musings and delineations requires book-length exposition and justification far beyond what is here possible. So for the remainder of the writing here, I will simply stipulate that such a vision of relative mutuality and reciprocity binding all of its co-dwelling creatures into bonds of constraint and limitation, largely defined in their evolutionary unfolding in terms of locally articulated by respective ecozones and ecotones, trophic scaling laws or force fields, is my taken for granted baseline. These are laws about who is eating whom in any given local ecosystem, which for 500 million years have correlated body size with population numbers inversely. The larger bodied you are, the less of you there are in the ongoing outworking of commensality and nutrition. That is, until humans invented agriculture and began coalescing 5,000 years ago into ever larger estates of monocropping enterprise ruled by elites, gobbling up more and more of the calories and energy on the planet at the expense of everything, everyone else. Do we think ourselves an exception to these 475 million year old structures of eating orchestrated to scale? Or have we set ourselves up for a huge die-off, as indeed we have already precipitated for so much of the rest of the biosphere? That for me is the big question that we who are programmed and ensconced in modernity have scarcely begun even to glimpse, much less face and wrestle. But is also arguably the central question indigenous cultures historically made integral to their cultural elaborations and ritual innovations, claiming usually to be guests and youngers, belonging to, taught by, and responsible for their ancestral lands and their elder, more than human kin, with all of those creatures' uniquenesses and confounding idiosyncrasies and grandiloquent intricacies. By compare with many of those indigenous societies back behind all of our contemporary cultures, we who are modern now begin to show ourselves as literally smaller brained, severely incapacitated in basic survival skills, and strangely oblivious to much of the reality we live in, with, and dependent upon. Oy vey then, just what does await us? The second stipulation of my offering here is a focus within our modern cultural formation on the growing tyranny of the image. When asking questions of bondage today in the third decade of the new millennium, it's imperative in my estimation to identify what forces are most ubiquitously enslaving us and how. What appears ever more insistently, but also ever more presumptively and simultaneously eclipsed, is the way that human desire and imagination are being radically reprogrammed and biochemically rewired by a corporatized regime of visual intervention and feedback, what surveillance capital author Shoshana Zuboff calls the largest scale behavioral modification program ever launched in history. The algorithmic volatilization of big tech data scraping, gleaning keystrokes and voice tonality, walking cadence, and spatial movement means that an avataristic profile now doubles virtually every human using social media on the planet, and the continuous repopulation of our propensities with ever thickening self-referencing sirens, galvanized by that high-tech doppelganger, means human identity embodiment is increasingly the product of, not the agent over, corporate manipulation in service of bottom line accumulation. And the surveillance so routinized coalesces its forcefulness in economic and political consequence simultaneously. The corporation gathers relentlessly with a view to marketing. The state collaborates ruthlessly with a view to control and preemptive interdiction. We are a society scrutinized and monitored like none other in history. And thus the particular focus here, whence the import of watching in our deep history, and what the potency of gaze and vision for both flourishing and demise. I do not intend here a simple remedy or an easy orientation. Rather, I would return watchful exchange to its evolutionary latency in our species' relationship to land and try to hint its liberative gift, counter its dominating monopolization by authority in reciprocities and wonderments circulating in communities at once human and more than human. With that as background, then, in the writing, what I do is take off from the way AI is being mobilized to surveil Black and brown communities here in inner city Detroit and arrest and incarcerate such, back through Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois's experience of, as a kid in grade school, having his world entirely shattered by the gaze of a white classmate whose eye channeled the entire history of race and bifurcated his reality. Back behind that to first century Rabbi Jesus saying, when your world is in full mode of collapse, the game is won or lost in the very first moment of perception. So watch. And then back to what is really key for everything I'm thinking about, which is Lakota lawyer theologian Vine Deloria talking about what it means in indigenous communities to live in a local topography, a local ecozone across multiple generations with ancestral bones buried under the soil, where the topographies, the soil, seasons, waters, weathers, plants, and animals all provoke ongoing reflection that gets codified in stories and myths and handed on, so that that landscape itself creates the human community. And humans belong to it. It does not belong to them. And then Deloria talks about a moment when those communities experience suddenly at some place in that topography being watched by a big presence that provokes dread and throws down a limit, basically saying, this is not for you. There are parts of this land that are not available for human beings. They are sanctuaries for other creatures and beings, not you. Stay out or pay the price of losing your life. That relationship with land is something modern humans, and I would say civilized humans over the last 5,000 years have lost. Final thing to say is Jacques Ellul comes along and talks about, in Hebrew language, the word for city. Once cities begin to coalesce, he describes them as embodiments of watcher angels, as if what a city is spiritually is an incarnation and incarceration of that watching presence, that big mystery of the land holding human communities to scale, now monopolized by elites putting everything and everyone else under surveillance in the project of rendering reality legible for the sake of appropriation, control, and collecting taxes. Thank you.
It was so loaded paper, and I need several readings to give a meaningful response. I do agree that I'm sitting before two giants, and responding to them is a Herculean task. But then I do dare to give some responses, some thoughts, my own thoughts, and probably as a community, as all of us, as we watch here, discuss, we get more insights and draw more from your paper. I see these two papers in continuation with our spotlight speaker had to say. How the first paper where internalization of blackness had happened, and then we say that how to overcome this transformative action. It is through subversive actions that transformation happens. So that means we need to give heed to the subversive voices, subversive actions, and that leads to transformative actions. In continuation with that, the two presenters, Dr. Jim, it was like how this invasive politics of interfering with the lives of people, where the issue of invasive politics, and that was there for such a long time, and we took it for granted. Surveillance took it for granted, and it was so normalized, and there was no question of it, and it was the normalized thinking. But then the questions are emerging: how normal it is? Is it not? Is it need to be interrogated and questioned? The powerful were always the norm, and how human desire, human imagination is being rewired. That's what she said. How our own human desires and imaginations are being rewired. And that I see in continuation with the blackness, how blackness is so much internalized that it becomes the norm, even for those who are subjugated. So how human desire and imagination is being rewired was so aptly said. So surveillance of this white gaze, and which destroys life actually. They say it is in terms of controlling, bringing an order or bringing social control, but then it is destroying life. It it uh, it uh, uh, it takes out the spark of life from people. So I don't have questions as such, but I would like to continue to engage with this aspect of how this gaze, this gaze is being there, and how we need to have a gaze need to be redefined so that we will have a more community aspect of watching each other, to be more accountable, to see one another grow.